There is a photograph taken in Bolivia in 1967 that almost nobody talks about. Not the famous one. Not the Corda portrait with the beret and the distant gaze that ended up on a billion t-shirts. A different photograph, taken after his capture in the schoolroom at La Higuera, hours before his execution. In it, Che Guevara is sitting on the floor, his back against an adobe wall, his hands tied. His boots are disintegrating. His clothes are filthy from months in the jungle. He has a bullet wound in his leg that hasn't been properly treated. He hasn't eaten a real meal in days. Around him stand Bolivian soldiers who look, frankly, uncomfortable, as if they are not entirely sure what to do with what they have caught. And Guevara is looking directly at the camera, not with despair, not with fear, with an expression that the soldiers who were there described years later in almost identical terms across dozens of separate interviews. He looked, they said, like he was in charge. That expression, that absolute, unshakable sense of occupying the center of whatever room he was in, even a dirt-floor schoolroom in a village of 30 houses where he was about to be shot. That expression is the key to everything, to understanding who Che Guevara actually was, to understanding why he ended up there, and to understanding why the story of his life, stripped of the mythology that accumulated around it like sediment, is not primarily a story about revolution or imperialism or the Cold War. It is a story about a man who became so completely captured by the image of himself that he lost the ability to see anything else clearly, including the walls closing in. Let's start somewhere that the biographies rarely start. Not in the Sierra Maestra, not in Bolivia, in Buenos Aires in the early 1950s, in a university library where a young medical student with chronic asthma and an unusually intense gaze is working his way through Marx, Freud, Nehru, Bertrand Russell, Jack London, and whatever else he can get his hands on, with a reading appetite that his contemporaries remembered as almost compulsive. Ernesto Guevara de la Serna read everything. He kept detailed notebooks of his reading. He formed opinions rapidly and held them with a grip that debate rarely loosened. His friends from that period described someone who was intellectually brilliant, genuinely funny in conversation, loyal to the people he chose as friends, and completely immovable once he had decided something was true. That last quality, remember it, it will matter. The motorcycle journeys through Latin America in 1951 and 1952 are the part of his biography that the mythology handles most carefully because they contain something genuine that the myth needs. The moment of transformation, the young man who goes out into the world and sees suffering with his own eyes and decides he cannot look away. It is real. The journals he kept are real. The leper colony in Peru is real. The miners of Chuquicamata are real. The poverty he witnessed across thousands of kilometers of the continent he had grown up insulated from in a comfortable Buenos Aires household. All of it is real and all of it mattered. But there is something else in those journals that the mythology tends to skip past. From very early in those travels, Guevara was not only observing the world, he was watching himself observe it. He was aware, with an intensity that sometimes reads as almost theatrical, of the figure he cut, the adventurer, the witness, the man who goes where others will not go and sees what others cannot face. The journals are full of a self-consciousness that sits alongside the genuine moral outrage. He was, from the beginning, simultaneously experiencing things and constructing a narrative about himself experiencing them. This is not a flaw unique to Guevara. Most people with strong personalities do it to some degree, but in Guevara it was unusually pronounced, and it became, over time, something that shaped his decisions in ways that had consequences for everyone around him. The Cuban Revolution made him famous. Fame confirmed something in him that had been building since those first journeys. By 1959, Ernesto Guevara had a proven record. He had crossed the Atlantic on the Granma, survived the near disaster of the landing, fought for 2 years in the Sierra Maestra, commanded the crucial Battle of Santa Clara that broke the back of Batista's army, and marched into Havana at the head of the revolutionary forces. That was real. That was earned. Nobody gave it to him. But what fame does to a man who is already intensely aware of his own narrative is not always straightforward. It doesn't necessarily make him more confident. It makes him more committed to the version of himself that the fame reflects back, and the version of Che Guevara that the world reflected back from 1959 onward was the invincible revolutionary, the man for whom the impossible was simply the next challenge, the guerrilla commander who had taken on Batista's professional army with a handful of fighters and won. That version was not entirely false, but it was incomplete. And Guevara began, in ways that are visible in retrospect if you read the primary sources carefully, to govern his decisions according to that version rather than according to the full, complicated reality. The Cuba years showed this pattern clearly. As Minister of Industry, he ran the Cuban economy on the basis of theoretical convictions that he held with the same unshakable certainty he brought to everything. The moral incentive system, the idea that revolutionary consciousness could substitute for material rewards as the primary driver of worker productivity, was not a hypothesis he was testing. It was a conclusion he had reached, and the economy was the terrain on which he was demonstrating it. When the results did not match the theory, the response was not to revise the theory. The response was to find explanations for the discrepancy that did not require revising the theory. The workers were not sufficiently ideologically developed. The bureaucracy was sabotaging the process. The external blockade was creating distortions. The Soviets were undermining the experiment with their revisionist influence. Every one of those explanations contained some truth, but the sum of them served a function that had nothing to do with economic analysis. They preserved the theory intact. This is a pattern with a name in psychology. It is called motivated reasoning. And in Guevara, it was not an occasional feature of his thinking. It was structural. By 1964, the friction between Guevara's vision and the direction Cuba was actually moving had become impossible to manage quietly. Cuba needed the Soviet Union. This was not ideology. It was arithmetic. Soviet oil kept Cuban industry running. Soviet grain supplemented Cuban food supply. Soviet military hardware kept the revolution defended against a United States that had already tried to invade once at the Bay of Pigs and had not abandoned the objective. Fidel Castro understood this the way a man understands gravity, not as a political position but as a condition of existence. You could resent gravity. You could theorize about a world without it, but you conducted your actual life within it. Guevara could not make that accommodation. His critique of the Soviet Union, that it practiced a form of imperialism toward developing nations, that its economic model had betrayed the revolutionary project, that its relationship with Cuba was one of exploitation dressed as solidarity, was not something he was willing to soften for diplomatic convenience. He said it in Algiers in February 1965 at an international economic conference in front of delegates from across the non-aligned world, with cameras recording everything. He said it clearly, and he said it completely. The Soviet Union, he argued, was complicit in the structures of global inequality it claimed to oppose. The Soviets heard it. Their message to Havana was equally clear. This cannot continue. Castro faced a choice that for him was not actually difficult. The revolution needed to survive. Survival required Moscow. Moscow required that Guevara be contained. The only form of containment that would actually work with a man like Guevara was to give him somewhere else to go. The framing was brilliant in its simplicity. Cuba had proven the model. The model now needed to be taken to other countries. Guevara, precisely because of who he was, the face of revolutionary internationalism, the man the world identified with the exportable revolution, was the natural person to carry it forward. It was presented not as removal but as elevation, not as exile but as the next chapter. Guevara accepted it. Whether he fully understood what was happening is a question historians still debate. What is not debated is that he accepted it, and accepted it in terms that made any return extremely unlikely. He surrendered his Cuban citizenship, his military rank, every institutional position he held. He wrote a letter to his children that is one of the most genuinely painful documents the entire period produced. And he left. The Congo was where the myth began its collision with reality. He arrived in April 1965, convinced that the conditions for successful guerrilla revolution existed in the eastern Congo. They did not. The local fighters organized their combat around ritual practices that were culturally coherent but tactically incompatible with what Guevara needed. The political leadership was absent from the field. The population was indifferent to the revolutionary project being imported from Cuba. The terrain, the language, the social structures, the history, everything was different from the Sierra Maestra in ways that the theory said should not matter, but that the reality demonstrated mattered enormously. 7 months. No territorial gains, no political progress. A retreat across the border into Tanzania that Guevara himself described as a failure. Here is the moment that, in retrospect, defines everything that came after. A man capable of genuine learning, a man who could update his model of the world based on evidence, would have come out of the Congo with a fundamentally revised theory. The FOCO model, he would have concluded, had been derived from conditions that were specific to Cuba, and its applicability to other contexts required much more careful evaluation of those contexts before committing lives to the test. Guevara came out of the Congo with a different conclusion. The conditions in the Congo had been wrong. The people had been unprepared. The leadership had been inadequate. The theory itself remained sound. What was needed was a context where the conditions were right. He spent months in Cuba in a safe house, hidden from public view, planning Bolivia. Bolivia was supposed to be the vindication. The geographic logic was real. Bolivia sits at the center of the continent, bordering 5 countries. The structural injustice was real. It was one of the poorest nations in South America, with stark inequality between the small elite and the rural poor. The history of labor militancy among the Bolivian tin miners was real. But Guevara arrived in Bolivia in November 1966, having made the same category of error he had made before the Congo, assuming that conditions he had not rigorously verified matched the requirements of the theory he was applying. The Bolivian peasantry was not waiting to be mobilized. They had received land under the 1952 agrarian reform and had a relationship with the Barrientos government that was not the relationship of an oppressed population with a hated regime. They were suspicious of outsiders. When the guerrilla column moved through their villages, they did not join. They informed the army. The Bolivian Communist Party withdrew its support after the opening negotiations collapsed. The urban network that should have provided supply lines and intelligence never materialized. Cuba provided almost no logistical support, for reasons that remain debated, but whose effect was identical regardless of the reason. And the Bolivian army, trained by U.S. Special Forces specifically for this operation, tracked the column with a professionalism that the FOCO theory had not adequately accounted for. The column shrank. The sick could not be evacuated. The food ran out regularly. The altitude worsened Guevara's asthma to the point where there were days he could barely walk. The two halves of the column lost contact with each other, and still, he continued, "This is the part that requires the most honest examination, because it is the part the mythology handles least well." By the middle of 1967, the evidence that the operation had failed was not ambiguous. It was not a matter of interpretation. The objective conditions, the column's size, its supply situation, the absence of peasant support, the absence of urban infrastructure, the quality of the counterinsurgency operation hunting them, all pointed in the same direction. A commander who was responding to reality rather than to his own narrative would have found a way out. Dissolution of the column, extraction of the fighters, acknowledgement that the conditions had not been what the theory required. Guevara did not do this. He kept going. He kept writing in his diary with the same clinical precision, recording the deterioration entry by entry, and he kept moving forward into terrain that was growing more hostile every week. Why? The honest answer, supported by everything we know about how he thought and what drove him, is that stopping was not compatible with who Ernesto Guevara understood himself to be. The man in that photograph on the dirt floor of the La Higuera schoolroom, the man who looked like he was in charge, even when he was a prisoner waiting to be shot. That man could not retreat from Bolivia any more than he could have chosen to stay in Buenos Aires and practice medicine. The image had become the reality. The narrative had consumed the man. Was not a hypocrite in the simple sense, a man who preached sacrifice while avoiding it himself. He went everywhere he sent others. He suffered what he asked others to suffer. He died in the place where his convictions led him. But conviction without the capacity for revision is not wisdom. It is a very expensive form of stubbornness. And the most uncomfortable truth about Ernesto Guevara, the truth that the T-shirt cannot contain, is that the qualities that made him iconic were inseparable from the qualities that made him dangerous to the people who trusted him most. He believed his own myth completely, and that belief in the end was what killed him. Not the CIA, not the Bolivian army, not Fidel Castro's political calculations, not the peasants who informed on his column. The man who destroyed Che Guevara was Che Guevara, the version of himself he had been building since those first motorcycle journeys, the version that could not stop, could not retreat, could not revise, because stopping and retreating and revising were not things that version of himself was capable of. He died exactly as that version demanded he should. Whether that was heroism or tragedy depends entirely on what you think a human life is for.